Hey you guys, it's Peter, and welcome to my channel, Peter Boom Boom Reviews Stuff. And I am back to review another television show. And today I'm going to be reviewing the docu-series on Netflix that is trending at number 3 in the United States for this week. And that is Killer Sally. And I just saw this come up, I think it was a day or two ago, and I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know anything about this case. If you don't know, which you don't know is a lot, I love watching anything that has to do with true crime. I actually have a true crime book club that I run with my good Judy Mel. It's listed below. It is called a True Crime Book Club, and you can join it on Facebook. We are getting started again in January. We already have a book picked out for January, and we read a book once a month, and then we go in and we have a live stream where we discuss the book that we've read. So anyway, yeah, I love to watch docu-series to do with true crime. I love to watch, true crime movies. In the last year, I think I've watched probably like 10. I've watched all of the ones that are out, that are, popular, that people talk about. But I had not heard anything really about this case. And the interesting thing about this case is that the murder occurred, which we're going to talk about, in 1995. I got sober in December of 1994, so this would have occurred right after that. It happened on Valentine's Day of 1995. So it would have happened in my first year sober, my first 60 days sober. So the fact that I wasn't watching the news or keeping up with really what was going on in current events doesn't surprise me, but it does kind of surprise me that I've never heard of this story before. It also introduced me to the world of bodybuilding and wrestling, which I don't know a lot about. And I have to say, I always am interested in watching docu-series or especially true crime documentaries when they have to do with subject matter that I really don't know anything about. I also love to watch, these are kind of the things for me that are important in watching documentaries. I think that it's always important when we're talking about a true crime documentary to also talk about the victim, and to talk about the victim's story and have people that are sharing with us what they knew of the victim. And it was interesting in this because in this docu-series, you get to hear Sally's side of describing her husband, Ray McNeil, but you also get to hear his friends. So it is important to me to also hear the story of the victim. It's also important to me, or I feel that it's a good docu-series. These are kind of the ways that I judge something. If it is like cohesive and comprehensive, and there's kind of some closure at the end. And I know with a lot of the documentary series that I've watched, especially even ones that I've loved, like The Keepers, where there is no closure because we can't have closure because there is no ending to it. I understand that, and I still love some of those series, but it just makes it so much better for me when there is closure. And this was a documentary where there was closure. Now, I will tell you that there are spoilers in my review, so I just want to share that. So this documentary was, it was a 3-part documentary, and I think it just came out this last week on Netflix. It's called Killer Sally, and it's about Sally McNeil and her killing her husband, Ray McNeil. Sally McNeil was, I think she's probably about 60 now. She and her husband were both in the bodybuilding world. They had gotten there via the armed services. Sally was a Marine, and she did a lot of amateur bodybuilding in the Marines and in the armed services, and had won, several of these bodybuilding contests and things like that. And I have to just tell you, like, I have never really had any interest in the whole world of bodybuilding. I mean, to me, honestly, it's like, okay, I really don't get it, but like, it was very fascinating watching all of this and like the world that goes on with it and all this kind of stuff. And, so, we kind of start in the way that a lot of people are saying that instead of it being 3 parts, it could have only been 1 part, and it could have been a lot shorter. And while I do agree with that, I felt like it was so cohesively done over 3 parts that I wasn't ever bored. Like, I didn't find myself ever like wanting to just like stop watching it, or I was bored with it. Like, I was intrigued watching it the entire time. So at the beginning of it, you hear about the murder, and then it flashes back to how Sally met Ray. And then it goes back and forth kind of like in talking about her growing up. At one point, I think that's in this, about this towards the end of the second part, and it goes in and talks about her growing up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and that she was in college, and then she couldn't afford her last semester of her senior year, and so she enrolled in the Marines, and from the Marines, she ended up meeting somebody and getting married, and she had her first child, which was her daughter Shantina, and then she had her second child, which was her son John, who are a huge part of this documentary, and then from there, she moved to California, and I think she moved to California, she said like May 25th or something, and like June 6th or something, she met Ray McNeil, and that was, so, and then like 2 months later after that, they were like married or pretty committed to, I think it was like 2 or 3 months after that they got married. So anyway, and they lived in this apartment, I think for much of their relationship, like 8 years. And most of their relationship revolved around him being a bodybuilder and wanting, and he went pro at one point, and taking steroids. That's a huge part of the story, is him taking steroids. And I have to tell you what was interesting to me about that is, and as an addict in recovery, and having heard a lot of people that have taken steroids, I don't know that they're as popular today as they were then, because I think now with so much drug testing that occurs in, you know, sports and things like that, that it's really difficult for people to use steroids and things like that. But back then, even though this one guy that was in charge of the bodybuilding federation or whatever, he talked about that one year he did drug testing and all the guys were like smaller than they usually were, and somebody sitting in VIP said, like, we come for the freaks, like we want to see like the super big guys, like don't drug test him anymore. So that was interesting to me, because you hear, you know, I've met people that were addicted to steroids and the raging, and you hear about all of that, of what happens with them, and that was a lot of what Sally talked about. This is a story of domestic abuse, you know, and how in 1995, domestic abuse, even though, you know, this was on the heels of the O.J. Simpson trial, and at one point, this reporter, she talks about, I can't remember, Diane Diamond, I think is her name. She talks about, like, you know, Lorena Bobbitt and all these different cases at Tonya Harding, and we were hearing about all of these women that were coming up, that were doing these horrible crimes, right? And then you hear about Sally McNeil that killed her husband. Sally McNeil, she is interviewed, and I think that's the one thing that is so different about this documentary series in comparison to a lot of documentary series that I've watched in the past, is that she is interviewed through this entire thing, mostly in prison, and at the end of it, they share that she got out after serving 25 years in prison. She was actually, she was sentenced to 19 years and ended up doing 25. And I'm not really sure why. She was sentenced to 19 to life, and she served 25. And she went before the parole board 5 years. I didn't look in to find out what happened and why she didn't get parole. But she did say that, like, the first time she said she was a domestic abuse victim, and that was why they denied her parole. So there was a lot of talking about her being a domestic abuse victim, and just how that was looked down on. And so one of the things that was the most interesting, like I was saying, was that she was interviewed through this entire thing. Now, when you watch a lot of true crime documentaries or documentaries about people's life, because this didn't really feel so much like a true crime documentary to me, it felt more like a telling of somebody's life, right? Like a memoir of what had happened to them. Most people aren't in, like, the subjects aren't being interviewed through the entire documentary. And, you know, she's highly judged. And the thing is that in watching it, it felt to me, and this is the other thing, like her kids are interviewed through the entire thing, and his friends are interviewed. So it's a comprehensive study of the situation that had occurred, right? It's not just a one-sided, biased, you know, whatever. And then there's people that are, you know, interviewed that work for, you know, like this woman that was an author. It was called, I think her book was called No Visible Bruises, and she was like an expert in domestic abuse cases. And then there were, like, you know, reporters that were interviewed, and then the prosecutor, who is extremely arrogant, even to this day, was interviewed. And so it was very comprehensive, but what was interesting to me was that she tried to be as honest and authentic as she possibly could. And in fact, at several different points, she says in there, this happened 27 years ago. Like, I'm not going to remember things exactly, and that doesn't mean that I'm lying. I just don't remember exactly how they happened. And I thought that that was so honest of her. The most interesting thing to me was that, and I think this is the part of the story that I think is really important, is that her kids' telling of the story, it was very obvious that from what they had seen and witnessed in the home, that she was an abuse of domestic violence, right? Towards the end of the show, the prosecutor kind of weaves this into the storyline, and then they start discussing it about how she had had a history of being aggressive, and she had even gotten into trouble when she was in the military, and she had gotten arrested about being aggressive with somebody else. And even her son at one point shares a story where she goes and starts punching this kid's father and all this kind of stuff. And there's a history there of her being very violent, right? And it was interesting because the woman that wrote the book, she said in there, and then there was also this whole storyline of that her husband was having an affair, had multiple affairs, right? And at one point she called the woman up on the phone and she said, if you ever show up at the gym again, I'm going to beat your ass. And this woman that had written this book called No Visible Wounds, she said, we want our domestic abuse victims to be perfect people, but that's not reality. Like, they're people just like everybody else, right? And there was this whole play, and it was interesting because she addressed exactly what the prosecutor was saying, because the prosecutor really played on this part that she was this bodybuilder, and she had marketed herself by all of this stuff that she did with this pro wrestling, where she would wrestle people one-on-one individually. And she called herself Killer Sally, which is where the title of the show comes up with. And basically kind of discussing the idea of gender, and that she was less of a woman because of her being a bodybuilder and the fact that she was strong physically and things like that. And, it was interesting to me in watching this, and have heard the story from so many friends of mine, through the years, and so many people that I know, whether they are men, in heterosexual relationships, or women in heterosexual relationships, or men or women in same-sex relationships, that it's not necessarily always about, it doesn't just necessarily have to do with gender. And the fact that this man wanted to reduce her level of being able to be victimized based on her gender, I thought was such an important part of this story to be told. And I was really happy that they included it in there. And she even said, he wanted to make me less of a woman based on this whole idea of, that all this kind of stuff, that I was, a bodybuilder, and I had been a wrestler, and I was strong, and all this kind of stuff. I don't know what to think. I got done watching it, and it was interesting watching the jurors, because there was a lot to be said about the case. He was cooking chicken, and she went in and she shot him, but she said she was terrified of him because he was choking her, but then there would be moments where she would say, I had it, I just had enough, and she said, I suffered a lot of PTSD. And this author shared that, and I had heard this before, that victims of domestic abuse, have the same kind of brain scans as people that have served in the military and things like that, right? And so was it that she just snapped and then kind of had enough, and then that night was enough, and she was terrified that her husband was going to leave her, that she would was obsessed with, and so she shot him because if I can't have him, nobody will, which was what the prosecutor kind of played it up to be? Was it that she really was afraid for her life? You kind of leave the documentary not really knowing. But I will say this, is that there was a strong part for me that really felt for this woman and her life. She had been a victim of domestic abuse her entire life, from her childhood through to marriage. I mean, it was very, very sad that she had really just struggled her entire life. And yes, she was a violent person. She had been somebody that had been fighting back her entire life. And there was even sexual abuse that occurred within this marriage. And it was interesting because they had this psychologist that interviewed her and did 9 hours of an interview with her, and said she definitely is an abuse victim, and that one of the hardest things for her to talk about was the sexual abuse. And I think that that's one of the stigmas in our society that we don't really talk about, is that is there sexual abuse within a marriage? And there absolutely 100% is, you know? And I think that was a really, I think for that reason, that was an important part of this documentary. One of the hardest things for me to watch was the night of the arrest. The kids were brought in to the police station with her, and after everything was said and done, and they didn't, and like, this was the thing that really kind of bothered me about the whole process, was they didn't really, like, they just kind of let her tell her story. They didn't inform her that, you know, she really needed, I mean, I think it was interesting because the author at the end said that she didn't think that she would get a different sentence today, that women that are abused are still getting the same sentences today in 2022, that the time difference isn't any different. But, you know, I hope to some degree that women are advocated for in, you know, police stations, and that we have women police officers, and there was a women investigator that was in this, but like, who is telling that person, like, you know, this would probably be in your best interest to get an attorney, okay, and not talk to us all through the night and give us every detail that's going to be used against you down the road. So there was a point when they brought in her son and daughter, Shantina and John, who are just really a fantastic part of the story, and really are very telling of what happened inside of that home, and they bring them in, and it's heartbreaking, because Shantina at one point says he wasn't a good man. She's like, at the point, she's like 6th grade at this point, right? And John is like 8 at the time. And he says, Mom, he says, remember what the police officer said, that if it was in self-defense, then nothing might happen. And he's like, I hope that, and I started like crying when I heard this. He said, I hope that one juror like sees you as innocent so that you get off, you know? And you think about kids in these situations. And he has a hard time with his mom later, because he's like, you weren't thinking about us when you did these things. And I think that's a hard situation, you know, as you get older, you know. And I've had friends of mine that have been in these situations before, and it's like, what do you do? What's in the best interest of my kids? You know, I don't know. And it was interesting because at the very end of the show, they share that she got out and she's now dating somebody else. And she says his friends are more worried for him than they are for me. They're like, do you know what she was in prison for? And, but she says, you know, I thought about appealing it. She's like, but I'm just so happy to be free. And so there is kind of at the end of the story, you know, like this conclusive ending that you get of, you know, and then her son and her have a good relationship again, and her daughter comes to visit her, and it was a very interesting documentary, you know, and just very sad. And at one point it was interesting because this best friend of his, who the whole time, it's like they all know that he had this woman that he was seeing on the side. And all of these men, it was kind of interesting to me. It was like all of these men were kind of like defending him, that he had this woman on the side that he was seeing, and that they were kind of like, I mean, it was kind of like, y'all wonder, okay, why your women are jealous and get upset, okay? This is why, right? Like, this is a good example. He was coming to all of these men and saying, like, I'm seeing this woman, I don't want to be with Sally anymore, right? And she speculated that he had a girlfriend on the side, and they were defending that to some degree. And the thing that was sad was, like, this one best friend kind of the whole time was like, I was so mad that my best friend was being talked about in the news and stuff this way, right? But then at the very end, he says, you know, because his wife is interviewed too, and he says, we kind of just wished that it would have ended differently and that they would have just gone their separate ways, you know. Obviously, that would have been what everybody would have wished for, you know. But that's not what happened. And it's just a tragic story. It was just absolutely a tragic story. You know, I'm not going to rate. I don't like to, if it's a true crime documentary story that happened, you know, 30 years ago or something. I guess this did happen 30 years ago, you know, but this is like a tragic story that's still occurring today. She got married, that they show that at the end, and her son walks her down the aisle, and yeah, and she's kind of to some degree got her life back and things like that. And you can tell she's a much more mellowed version of herself than she was at the beginning. And, you know, there was a childhood friend of hers that's interviewed through much of this, and she says, I don't know why she never told anybody. I think she was ashamed. I think she just was ashamed and she didn't want anybody to know. And I think that is like such a huge part of this story. It's like she wanted this idea, and she doesn't really ever say this, but you can kind of tell that she wanted this idea of everybody to think that they were like this perfect couple, you know, this perfect bodybuilding couple that loved each other and were obsessed with each other, and that just wasn't the case. And she knew that, and she was doing anything that she possibly could to hold on to it. You know, at the end of the day, nobody's going to really know what happened behind closed doors, but I thought it was a really well done docu-series. I thought it was very cohesive, and so if you're looking for something good that's binge-worthy on Netflix, I would highly recommend it. And if you don't know anything about the bodybuilding world and the wrestling world, trust me, you will find out a lot. So anyway, let me know what you thought about the series in the comment section below. I love you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.